The following program is produced by Marshfield Community Television.
When we started planning for this month's local history seminar talk, we were kicking around some ideas and Marshfield Illustrated came up. I don't know how many people are familiar with the book Marshfield Illustrated. Anybody have a copy or see a copy before? I know Lori's got one there that she can share, and
There's one behind you.
oh, and my copy's here. And then the Historical Society also has copies. But Marshfield Illustrated is a small pamphlet that was produced by the Marshfield Times back in 1905. And it's a brag book, basically. It's one of those books that people paid to have their name put into it. And so when you read the story about Upham Mill, it's very flowery. You read about the Drinkowitz cigar factory, it's very flowery. So there's a lot of really positive things said about the Marshfield businesses that existed in 1905. Now, we'll go through and talk about some of them. There's 32 pages, and it's more than we can talk about in an hour's time. So I just went through and kind of selected some that we could talk about or use as an example. And then because what's nice about history is not just sharing, it started in this year, went to this point, ended, this person took over. There's some little stories that I'll try to put in between each of the businesses that I think are of interest and add to the story of Marshfield. So we'll start there. And the first one, this is the cover of the book, Marshfield Illustrated, and it was published by a guy named C.W. Charles. And back in 1905, it was very common to abbreviate everybody's name with the first two initials, W.H. Upham, W.D. Connor, C.B. Edwards. Everything was with initials. This guy wasn't a Marshfield resident, permanent Marshfield resident, so trying to find him has been very difficult. In 1875, there was a C. Charles living in the town of Dexter, and in 1910, there was a C. Charles living over in Barron County. We don't have anything to pinpoint specifically who he was. And so right now we know that C.W. Charles came to Marshfield in 1905 and helped produce this book. I don't want to say he worked for the Marshfield Times, but he worked with the Marshfield Times to publish this. And then he just basically disappears. So the first thing is we have an unknown entity writing these stories, and it wasn't uncommon for traveling reporters to come in and prepare something and then leave and go on to the next town. The other thing about this publication is if you look on the flyer that went out, it says 1905 Marshfield Illustrated. Nowhere in the booklet itself do you find the date 1905. What you have to do is look at one of the opening paragraphs, and it says everything of any consequence in Marshfield dates from the big fire. This conflagration, which 18 years ago, we know the fire occurred June 27th, 1887. You add 18 years to it, so it was published in 1905. There's also one of the businesses that are mentioned that are in here that was established in May of 1905, so you know it had to have been published after May of 1905. The picture that's there was actually a C.W. Charles photograph that he took of Central Avenue, and it appeared in the Marshfield Times in October of 1905. The front cover picture was 1 week, and the following week there was the picture from the back cover. It credits the photo to him, but it doesn't say when it was taken. So what we're doing is we're going through the Marshfield Illustrated and technically pulling out little pieces of information to use for history. So I mentioned it was 16 or 32 pages, 16 pages of text, and 16 pages of photographs. And when you look at the original copy of the booklet, the pictures look pretty good. Copying and scanning them doesn't really do them justice, but we're going to use them as much as possible because it's really what I wanted you to see is what was in the book rather than adding other things to it. So the first time I heard about Marshfield Illustrated had to do with the recorder column. And I thought it's important for people to realize that this column exists because the lady who worked for the Marshfield News Herald from the time it was organized in 1927 to 1971 or 2, I think it was, somewhere in that time frame, was a phenomenal historian as well as a reporter. And she double-checked, questioned everything. And one of the things that was nice about her is that when she started doing the research on the history of Marshfield, she had access to all the records that were at the Marshfield News Herald, and she had this uncanny ability of knowing everybody. She grew up in Nasonville and Marshfield. Her father owned a shoe store on Central Avenue, and she would find something that she questioned, and as soon as she questioned something, she went out and tried to find someone that could verify that information. History books that were written before she came into the News Herald and started doing this research are annotated all over the place with her little corrections. She would go through them and there would be notes written in pencil on the sides of the pages that she talked to this person and he verified that the date was April 2nd, 1872, or April 1st, 1872 rather than 1871. So she was really good at tracking down and verifying the pieces of information that we talk about and think about just as, well, that's the way it was. It was established as that date. She was recognized by the State Historical Society in 1954, and actually I shouldn't say she. She and the Marshfield News Herald were recognized in 1954 by the State Historical Society with Award of Merit. It's an award the Historical Society gave for people who contributed to recording or documenting the history of the state of Wisconsin. And in 1954, she and the newspaper received that. And then in 1971, she was honored here in town as Marshfield's Lady of History. By that time, she had been working on the News Herald for over 40 years. She had done the column for the recorder column for Marshfield for 24 years. She had done the We Have With Us Every Day column for more than 3 years. Looking backwards, there are several other columns that she did. She was a phenomenal dynamo, basically, when it comes to recording history for the town. And she was instrumental in getting the Marshfield, or the Northwood County Historical Society, on its feet in the early days. So this particular column, the Marshfield Illustrated column, appeared in 1955, and I didn't read it then. I read it years later. I was looking through old newspapers, and that's where Marshfield Illustrated came up. And so she went through and talked about the Marshfield Illustrated, and it almost sounded like the book was kind of lost for 50 years. There was a guy in town called John Hebel. He grew up in Marshfield. And he brought the book to the attention of her, and they shared it with a bunch of the old timers in town and kicked around what was all in it. And then she wrote this column about what was included in Marshfield Illustrated, what was factual about it, what happened to some of these businesses afterwards. She was a storyteller, and that's part about being a historian that's important, is to tell the stories. And so to start off with, Amanda Hendricks is someone that we need to remember when we're doing our historical research and comparisons. She always has good things documented. Now when it comes to the book itself, in the introduction it talks about the fire. I already mentioned that. But it goes on to say that the fire nearly wiped out some of the businessmen of that day. But after a few months, elegant blocks succeeded the burned out establishments, and the ragged-looking Main Street of former days took on this architectural beauty. And Marshfield was always very proud of the brick buildings that rose up out of the ashes from the fire. Frank Cady, a year or two after the fire, had written something about rising like a phoenix from the ashes, and Marshfield had a reputation for becoming a very modern appearing city because of the results of that fire. Now, there's two pictures in the book on Main Street, just street schemes. This one here is actually 3rd Street looking north on Central Avenue, And then the other one is First Street looking south, or Depot Street looking south. What I wanted to do though with this picture, because one of the fun things about looking at old pictures is picking out what's in them and what isn't in them. And so we know that, for example, the building on the left-hand side there came down, and it was taken down, and a new bank building was put up about 1918. Big Cloverland Bank on Central Avenue with the big pillars. So you know that picture was taken before that. But you can also see in the picture that there's a light fixture hanging at the intersection. Marshfield had put in its first street lights in 1886. And when the lights were put in, the city council required the lights to hang 35 feet up in the air. And the wires were drawn between the buildings, and then the lights suspended in the center of the block. There were 5 lights, one on 4th Street, another on 3rd, another on 2nd, one on Depot, and then one on Adler. And so we had street lights back in 1886, and they operated on a system called the Philadelphia system, which meant they came on at dusk and went off at midnight, trying to cut the cost. The city paid $5 a month for each light for keeping the street lit at that time. Then we had telephone poles start to appear in the 1890s. I sent Mike Myers an email just to verify the date. But in 1893, the city council and one of the telephone companies had some issues. Telephone companies started putting up telephone poles, and the city council didn't like it because they were putting them up in such a way that they felt that it was a nuisance. And so they filed an injunction, and the telephone company came in at night and put in the poles. Several months went by, and there was an ordinance proposed to the city council in October of 1893 that allowed the telephone poles to be erected. And so our first telephone poles really started to appear in 1893. And then the last one is the fire hydrants. You look down there, there's a small fire hydrant. Marshfield was lucky. We had fire hydrants in 1883. If you think back about big fires in Marshfield, one of the fires that they talked about early on, but before the Marshfield fire, was the Rivers Hotel. It occurred in January of 1883, and it's actually what pushed the city to go on and incorporate as a city so that they could charge taxes and actually develop a fire force, develop a fire department. So in 1883, January of 1883, this building starts on fire. What do we know about our old January winters? They were cold. 26 below zero that day. All the water was frozen. And so this fire starts behind a chimney in a 3-story hotel building on Central Avenue where Founders Square sits now. They could unload the entire building of all the furniture, but they couldn't put it out because there was no water to fight the fire, and the building burned to the ground. So that was the reason we formed as a city in April of 1883 and could have our own fire department. So there's things in pictures that are fun to look at that make you think about history and some of the other things that are going on in the city. Then this is the Thomas House. It's now set back away from Central Avenue. But you're looking at Central Avenue looking south from the corner of Depot and Central. And I put this circle here because as I was growing up, and some of you will probably remember this too, Marshfield used to have a really big building on the end of each side of that block. There was the Thomas House, a 3-story building on the north side of Central between 1st and 2nd, or Depot and 2nd. And then there was the Adler block, which was another 3-story building. But it wasn't always 3 stories. And so one of the things that's nice to do is when you're looking at old pictures is see what buildings have changed or how buildings have changed. And in this one of the ways of telling when a picture was taken is by looking at the height of the Adler building, because it changed at a certain point. The book goes on and talks about, in reviewing commercial events which have conspired to the municipal prestige of Marshfield, it is the desire to deal briefly in detail with men and merchants who are directly responsible for the city's growth in population and commercial splendor. Guy's really flowery. I wish I could write and talk like that. But he goes on to say that he only had limited space, basically, and he had to pick and choose who he was going to include in this book. And so he was going to pick the leading firms in each of a couple of different areas to include in his publication. Now, when Amanda looked at this, she said that they paid that it was a subscription service, where people who subscribed to the book would be included in the book, and those that didn't weren't. I can't find any advertising in the paper saying that they were selling the spaces, the stories. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I can't find anything where he's advertising for people to submit information to him either. So chances are he went around and met people and talked about subscriptions that way. So one of the things about that, though, is I don't know for sure how he selected everyone, and there are more businesses that can be covered in this story or in this booklet than I can cover in an hour's time tonight. So I also went through and just kind of picked and chose some of the stories that I would include, or some of the businesses that I'd include, and then I also added some things that I thought were important about those businesses so we know what happened to them. So the first one, and it makes sense that this is the first one that was included in the booklet, is the Upham Manufacturing Company. We know that the Upham Manufacturing Company was an important piece of Marshfield history because it was really the stabilizing force in the community when they first came to Marshfield. Prior to 1878, we have some small businesses, and it's kind of a rough and tumble town. 1878, Mr. Upham comes, he establishes the sawmill on 2nd Street, and then he also builds the store on Central Avenue at the same time. And then over the course of the next several years, he adds one business after another, to the point when in 1887 in Marshfield burns, he's really the major employer of the city of Marshfield. He has 5 businesses: the sawmill, the planing mill, a furniture factory, a flour mill, the powerhouse. And he also, in 1887, had the store on Central Avenue. So he was really involved with the community. One of the things that the book talks about, and I hadn't ever thought about it this way when I thought about the Upham Furniture Factory, or the Upham Manufacturing Company, is the amount of footprint that it held in the city. 20 acres of land in the heart of the city, which was the heart of the city today, was where his manufacturing entities were located, all in a nice little area. And this picture shows them all kind of crowded together. You've got the furniture factory, the sawmill, the planing mill, the powerhouse, the flour mill, the elevator, all of them in a nice tight area. And so I hadn't thought about it that way, but it really is kind of a cool thing to think about with Upham. And I'm going to come back to this page in a minute. Here's a picture of a map that was created of Marshfield in 1891. And if you look at this map, we have Central Avenue running down here. Then you have the Sioux Line, or the Wisconsin Central Railroad tracks, coming through here. And when Mr. Upham came to Marshfield in 1878, he bought all of the land. If you take that block between Chestnut Street and Walnut Street and divide it in half, he bought everything west of that half line, that center line, over to Oak Avenue. And that's where his plants were. And you can see here again, you've got the sawmill, the furniture factory, the grist mill, or the elevator. His home is down here. He had everything kind of west of that first block that was his. If you look at what that land is today for the city of Marshfield, what do we find in there? We've got the Weinbrenner Shoe Factory on the site of the old furniture factory. We'll talk about Weinbrenner for a second. We also have all the ball diamonds, the parks along Oak Street that are occupying land that he owned at one time. Now, it's not that he bequested the land of the city. It was through a series of different things that the city came to own those again. But in the 1880s, the Upham Manufacturing, the heart of the city, the heart of the business community for Marshfield, was over on that property. And today that same area is used by the city every day, and we never give a thought to Upham. And that's one of the things that feel bad about when I think about Upham is he doesn't get the credit he really deserves for things he did years ago. So anyway, this is the picture of the Upham Manufacturing Company in the 1890s. And I wanted to go back to this picture a second. One of the things that's important with Upham is remembering that he was the major employer in the 1880s. When he went out of business, after he died in 1924, the furniture factory was the last business that the family had open. They kept it open until about 1927. And then during the Depression, Work Projects Administration actually took down those buildings. They gave people jobs during the Depression by dismantling what was left of the old furniture factory over here. And these were still there. And the sawmill and stuff was all taken out during that time. And then after the buildings were down, Works Project Administration came in and helped build the Weinbrenner Shoe Factory and provided work again. And then after the Depression was over, that same factory provided employment. It still provides employment to people here in town today. And again, it goes back to that connection to Upham that we don't tend to think about. But we still have areas in the city that Upham had control of at one time that contribute to the health and well-being of the city today. The other thing about Upham is I mentioned the last business that he had before he died. It was the the Upham Furniture Factory, and that was a large establishment. When it came to the Upham Furniture Factory, it produced a lot of furniture, and we still hear from time to time of different pieces of furniture that will show up. That someone will call and say, "We have a piece of Upham furniture." Or they'll send a photograph to the the Northwood County Historical Society and say, here's a picture of a piece of furniture we have that was manufactured at the Upham factory. We're lucky to have, we have 4 catalogs at the mansion for the Upham furniture catalogs. And it was nice quality furniture that the company produced. And what's important is the Upham sawmill would produce 15 million board feet a year of freshly cut sawed lumber. It produced 19 million shingles. But the 15 million board feet, most of that went into building the furniture that was used in the Upham Furniture Factory. Now there's a point made in a 1889 newspaper article about the Upham factory. It said that 48 carloads of furniture left the Upham factory a month. 48 carloads is a lot of railroad cars. But it goes on to talk that each carload would hold at least 60 bedroom suites and 400 bedsteads. And that included the side rails, footboard, headboard, and it could have been a chest of drawers, a dresser, a wardrobe, nightstands, could have been any of that, but 60 sets in one train car. Averages about a month, about 2,000 bedroom suites and another 3,000, almost 3,000 bed sets. So the Upham Furniture Factory produced a lot of material during the early part of the 1900s. Now, he wasn't the only factory in Marshfield, and I thought this one was important to mention because a lot of us that have homes in the Pleasant Hill district or a lot of the older homes in town, the trim work or the interior work, the finishing work in the houses were done in the Hans Billy Fixture Factory. Again, because everything was flowery, it says it was one of the most important fixture factories in the state. And it furnished a lot of the trim work for houses. It also provided trim work for bars and businesses downtown. And it wasn't just in Marshfield. There are numerous accounts in the newspapers where they talk about Mr. Billy going in and putting a bar into a place in Ladysmith or Prentice or Phillips. So he did do work all around. Now, the newspaper, or the story that's in Marshfield Illustrated said that The business, or Hans Billy's factory, was established in 1898. I know that Hans Billy did the woodwork in my house, and it was built in 1892. So I looked at that and I had kind of a question right away that this can't be right. And that's one of the things that you have to do. You have to question everything when you're looking at history that's written before. And I hope that people will go through and look at the Marshfield history books and question things that they find in there too. So anyway, I looked at this and I thought that's got to be wrong. When you look at look for information in 1905, it mentions that he was located on Central Avenue between 4th and 5th Street. But you can find a newspaper clipping that says in 1903 he was building on 9th Street. But newspaper articles said Central and Avenue, and then later on it mentions being on West 9th Street. And this actually is the establishment that was on West 9th Street, and it was sold in 1918 to Miller Brothers, and they used it for storage. So that's one building. Then I wanted to kind of show you some examples. Now, it mentioned in Marshfield Illustrated that the company was formed in 1898. Here's a paper, an article from, let me think, that's Marshfield Times in 1902, where it says that the company was actually formed in 1893. And that would be consistent with what you start seeing with him. In 1893, he was also hired as a contractor by H.C. Ike to do some work in his residence. And at that time, they had to go to Eau Claire to get the finished products. So it kind of tells you that before July of 1893, he wasn't manufacturing his own trim work and stuff. And then in 1895, you see this ad where he's advertising as a contractor and a builder, gives his address between 4th and 5th Street. So in 1895, you have an idea where he's at. And then in 1897, it mentions that he's purchasing an engine, a steam-powered engine probably, so that he could be producing more products. But it's interesting when you read the history to find little bits and pieces to add to the story. Another thing that's interesting about Mr. Billy is he was a contractor. He built things. A lot of the houses in Marshfield, you know, when it comes to the old houses, we know that Benedum was the architect and the contractor for the Upham house. When we look at a house that was built by Hans Billy, you wonder who the architect was. Hans Billy had an older brother, Chris, who went to school and became an architect. And he was actually the architect for most of the houses that Billy built before 1902. The reason it ends in 1902 is his brother had consumption. He left town, went to Minneapolis thinking he could get better health care there, and he died of the disease. The Savings Bank store is another store that's mentioned in Marshfield Illustrated, and I always liked the name the Savings Bank store. And the Savings Bank store was one of these businesses in town that liked to give away souvenirs, or maybe they sold them, I don't know, but you'll see a number of different historical pieces from Marshfield that have Savings Bank store on them. It might be a piece of red glassware, a piece of pottery or something, but Savings Bank store shows up. And so that is interesting. And it's also one of the older businesses in town. It was first established in 1894 by a guy named M.J. Krause. He sells it in 1902 to Robert Girth and his brother William. William is the older brother, I shouldn't say he's older. William is the brother who comes to town after the store is bought. He spends about a year here, and then he packs up and leaves and goes to Seattle. And Robert continues in the store until he sells it after 1910. But what's interesting about this particular store is that for years it was known as the Savings Bank store, and it had a very unique name. And now, before I get to the name, it also did a couple things that were kind of cool in Marshfield. First one is, we talked about the electric service in Marshfield with streetlights. Remember I showed you that streetlight that went up in 1886? Marshfield didn't have full electric service until 1907. We talk about it having electricity, but the electricity didn't run 24 hours a day until September 16th, 1907. And this is an ad, the first ad that shows up where they're advertising electrical things for sale at Christmas time. And what's kind of cool about this here is, if you look at it, there's this little steam engine here where they're selling electric machines and motors for anywhere from 98 cents up to $3.25. They're also selling flat irons and lamps. And the lamps are actually in the next week's ad, so I just pulled that for here. But they're selling lamps and starting to sell electric things. After this, you can find ads for flat irons and things like that. But this full-page Christmas ad tells you that Savings Bank store was a pretty moving store at the time, I think. They also have this very cool picture on this particular ad, and it reminded me of something that appeared in a paper in 1904. And I have to go to the next page for this. Anyway, on the left-hand side there is a story that said, Saturday, the management of the Savings Bank store created holiday enthusiasm among children by a representation of Santa Claus drawn around town in a Lang & Sharman's car. 1904 seems pretty early for a car. However, first car, who had brought the first car to Marshfield? Jerry Blodgett, 1901. He was actually living in Minneapolis and drove over here in 1901. But this is the first one with Santa Claus in it. So I thought that was kind of a cool story where they took an early automobile and made use of it to benefit the kids in town. Then there was an incident that came up in 1910. And in 1910, the banking commissioners came and visited Mr. Girth at his store and said, you cannot have the name Savings Bank. There's a law that says that if you're going to have the title bank or savings bank in it, you had to be a bank. It wasn't allowed for a business name, a commercial business name. And so he writes a letter to the people in Marshfield announcing that the name was going to change for his store. And he goes through and talks about it, and about the commissioner coming, and that he had no choice in but changing the name. And then they deliberated on what the name was going to be. And because their motto had been your money's worth or your money back, he wanted to stick with that, and he said he thought the fair was appropriate because a fair price for fair product. And so in 1910, the Savings Bank store became the Fair store in Marshfield. But those of us who remember the Fair store don't remember this store. And it's one of those things that when you hear the Fair store, you immediately think of 231 South Chestnut on the Tip Holton Camp store, or where McCrory's was. That was where the Fair store was. But there was another Fair store before that one. And so in 1910, the Savings Bank store became the Fair store, and it stayed the Fair store until 1928. We'll talk about why it changed in a little bit here. So this is a picture of it as the Fair store. Well, it still says the Savings Bank store on it. But the name was changed in 1910. I don't know if the changing the name impacted Mr. Girth or helped him make the decision to sell his store. But in 1911, he sold the store to a Mr. Kirkwood, and then it was operated by a guy named M.J. Fleckenstein. And Fleckensteins had been in town since the fire. And in 1915, M.J. Krause comes back to Marshfield and buys the store again and takes it over. He keeps it until 1924 when it's sold to Mr. and Mrs. Schubert. Mrs. Schubert's sister was Anna Cole, and together Anne and Mrs. Schubert had the style shop, the Cole Style Shop on Central Avenue, and her husband managed the Fair store. In 1929, the paper starts advertising it as the Schubert's Variety Store, formerly the Fair store. And in 1932, it sold Greek True Blood. It operates for a couple of years and then it closes. But why in 1929 did they change the name from the Fair store to Schubert's? And that's because Tiff Holton Camps. And one of the things that's kind of cool about looking at some of these is there's always a cause and effect between this happens and that caused that to happen. Tiff Holton Camps was a mainstay of Central Avenue from before it says founded in 1887. But it was a really early store. P.J. Krause established it, then he had as a partner Tiffold, I.P. Tiffold. When Krause wanted out, he sells everything to Tiffold. Tiffold takes on a new partner. The new partner is William H. Krause, or Camps, and then it becomes Tiffold and Camps. And it stays Tiffold and Camps until 1897, when William Camps, I can't think if it's his brother, Fred Camps comes and joins him. I can't remember if he's a brother or son. I think he's a brother. Joins in, and then it becomes the Tiffold Camps Mercantile Company. Stays Camps Mercantile Company, or becomes Camps Mercantile Company in 1927. Mr. Tiffold had died in 1924. His wife had an interest in the company until 27, and then she sold to her share of the store to the Camps brothers, and it became Camps Mercantile Company. At this point, W.H. Camps is getting older, and so they start negotiating with a company from Milwaukee to sell the store, and they sell the store in 1928. I don't know if he died before they sold it or after, but it was sold, and they bring in this new company from out of town, and the store is renamed the Marshfield Fair Store. So in July 1928, we have the Marshfield Fair Store here, which is the bigger store in Central Avenue, and now it's competing with the Fair Store across the road and down the road. And so the across the road and down the road changed the name to Schubert's Variety Store. But it's one of those things where it's kind of fun to look at how one thing affects something else. The book also contains a number of photographs of homes. And since we just were talking about P.J. Krause and William H. Camps, I thought we'll use our two pictures to make a point. Picture on the left is P.J. Krause's house. He built our house in 1892. 2 years later, he sells our house and moves up to the West 5th Street and builds the house that still stands on the corner of 5th and, is that Wisconsin? I think it's Wisconsin.
Hardacre.
No, it's down from there. I think it's Wisconsin. Anyway, so he puts up this big house there. And one of the things about the 1890s was when they were building houses, they were building big houses. And so if you look at this house, and I kick myself today because I drove by that house when I was a kid all the time. This was at 110 North Maple Street, and it was W.H. Camp's house. Came down in 1990. I should remember what it looked like. It wasn't that long ago. And all I remember is the parking lot behind St. Denis. And that's where it's at. But it was, look at the size of that house. And there was a large number of houses of that size built in the 1890s. And that one and that one, this one is gone, that one survived. Same thing is true of these two. The house on the left survives. That's J.P. Hume's house. It was known as the Towers. It's the mocked house on Park Avenue. I can't remember who owns it right now, but it's still as beautiful a house today as it is then. That particular angle is taken from the side street looking at it rather from the front where you can see the carports. And then C.E. Blodgett's house on Central Avenue is another one of those big houses on Central Avenue that existed. The house, the Towers is still here, and the C.E. Blodgett house is gone. Again, just progress, but one of the problems with some of the houses that were originally built was they were built really close to Central Avenue or on Central Avenue, and as time marches on, they want to put in a gas station or a grocery store. Things got in the way, or a parking lot. Parking lots seem to be the big one in Marshfield, and so you lose them. The other one is houses got changed. These are two houses on Vine Street. The house on the left is E.M. Deming's house, another Johnson house. This was the house that Bob Mikulski lived on. It's on the corner of 3rd and Vine, southwest corner of 3rd and Vine. It was a huge house. The columns are gorgeous. There was a fire there. Half the house was destroyed, and so the house that exists is still a big house, but it's only about half of the house that was originally there. And then this house is the Sexton house on the southwest corner of 2nd and Vine, across from Shirley Mook's house. It was a huge house, and Mrs. Sexton thought it was too big, and she had parts of it taken off. and she changed the roof line because she thought it looked too old-fashioned. She removed the wraparound porch. There are some beautiful houses that still exist in town that you don't know what they looked like back then because we don't think about the old pictures enough. But there's examples of really large houses that went up in the 1890s that are either gone, and you think about over where the Citizens National Bank area, Associated Bank, that was all old Victorian homes in there at one time. Where the telephone company was, there was big old homes there. And all along Maple Street, behind Central Avenue, there were big houses in there too. So, time changes. And then I wanted to touch on this one, views of Marshfield Bedding Company, because not everybody was successful. And the Marshfield Bedding Company actually started in 1894. It provided employment to start with to about 20 people. And then by 1905, it provided employment to 50. And what I liked about it in the description was it employed 50 men and women. And most of the time when you look at these things that are produced in the early 1900s, they talk about providing employment to men. But here they included women. And if you look at the factory, it's a two-story factory. The women were actually employed upstairs, the men were employed downstairs. Downstairs they produced the spring coils that were used for the mattresses, and the mattress or brass and iron beds were produced downstairs. And upstairs the women worked on sewing together the ticking for the mattresses themselves. But they were separated in their description of the employment places. Now, most of the time, when it looked like, when you look at the sales area, it sounds like that the finished product from the Marshfield Bedding Company went to the Dakotas, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. They actually had a couple of guys that were traveling salesmen for the company, so they were out peddling the product to different people. Between 1894 and 1905, the company seemed to be doing very well. After 1905, the company kind of went downhill. In 1910, Harry Handwright was made the receiver because the company was in financial distress. And in September of 1910, there was a public auction to sell the product so they could pay back the creditors. But this is one of the companies that didn't make it in Marshfield. And one of the things that, and I should mention, like the Fair store had two different stores. There was the Marshfield Bedding Company, then there was the new Marshfield Bedding Company, and then they changed or just dropped the new off of it. So up until 1910, there's the bedding company. Then there's a 5-year period where there's no bedding company. In 1915, a new company comes in, forms to form the new Marshfield Bedding Company. And it was around quite a few years. So, but they did drop the new out of it, off the title. Now, there's a couple things that are, that I thought were kind of cool things that showed up in the research for the papers. And when Marshfield had a 4th of July celebration, all the businesses got involved. And when you read the story here about the float that the Marshfield Bedding Company had, I thought it was kind of cool. And their little motto that 1/3 of your life is spent in bed, to rest well, buy your bedding of the Marshfield Bedding Company. So, you know, just that they did something for the community with the parade, but they also had a plug for their business, so, which is good. And then again, with a business that has, depends on Excelsior, a lot of the mattresses had Excelsior in them, potential risk of fire. And in 1902, there was a fire at the Marshfield Bedding Company. And it occurred on a Sunday night. They were sure that it was arson, that someone had come and set the business on fire. And so the insurance adjusters came in and praised the Marshfield Fire Department for getting the fire out, but there was still $10,000 worth of damage. The owner of the company went to the city and said, we want to have this investigated. A woman was seen walking down the railroad tracks behind the Marshfield Bedding Company that night, and they decided it was her that did it. They had people, actually had a public hearing and arrested her and put her in jail until the trial. So on February 20th, she was arraigned and put in jail. The description of her struck me as kind of reminded me of the witch trials in Massachusetts, because it said Mrs. McGill is an old, infirm, and poor, with few friends who are able to give her financial assistance. She ended up spending time in jail because they didn't have the $80 that was needed to pay the bond. And so she spent from February until May in jail in Wisconsin Rapids. And then her trial was held in May of 1902. And actually, it's 3 columns, a full front page, talking about the trial. There's almost like a transcript for the entire trial, talking about who was the witnesses that were called for the defense and who were called for the prosecution, and in the end they acquitted her. There wasn't enough evidence, and she had people, she had gone to the store and bought a book, and the clerk said she was here at 7 o'clock. She couldn't have been there at 7 o'clock. Somebody saw her and looked at his watch just before he saw her and said that she had to have been on Central Avenue at that time, so she was acquitted. There's no record after that of who started the fire, but it's one of those things that's interesting. Marshfield's a small town and everybody got involved, so. But in this case, it was good results for her. One of the things that were said is she started the fire because her husband had been the night guard and he had been discharged in October, and that she was doing it as revenge because he had been fired. Now, the truth of that story I don't know anymore, but again, it's one of those things that it's the stories that add to the history. It's not just it started in this year and ended in that year. Anybody recognize that building? Is anybody a member of the Elks? That's the Elks building across the road right there. After the Marshfield fire in 1887, the Weber family owned it. They put up a soda factory, and they used it for making soda there. When they sold it, William Wenzel purchased it, and in 1905 he remodeled it as a cigar factory on the lower level and office space on the second level. The lower level was taken over by Paul Drinkwitz. He had a cigar factory, and again, when you read this, Marshfield boasts of a cigar shop which is probably a model of its kind in the state, if not the country. And he talked about the walls being white and the floors painted white and how clean it was. Just the perfect place to make cigars. And Marshfield was, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, brought tobacco in and made lots of cigars. I think there was maybe 10 cigar factories in Marshfield at one time. The Weber family had 3 or 4 by themselves. Holtz was over by where the Pretty building is. Lots of people made cigars in Marshfield. Right after Mr. Drinkwitz took possession of the building or the space, he went to Milwaukee to secure tobacco products. And then he came back up here in November of that year. He formed a new cigar company, Hub City Cigar and Tobacco Company, but he didn't last long. And so in 1905, he's advertising his cigars. He actually had 5 different brands of cigars that he made. The Templar was a 10-cent cigar, and the other ones were a nickel apiece. And this was the pride of the store. But he was there for about a year, well, actually less than a year, and in May of 1906, he sells his house and he moves down to Peoria, Illinois. And so it's one of those businesses that was here for a short time. It's a business, though, that if you look at the building long enough and think about it, you have to remember that how the front is shaped of the Elks Club, and it just is very easy to see that that's the building. His house at 309 South Cherry is still there. It became Fred Camp's home, and Fred Camp's family lived in it until, I don't remember, they were there when I was a kid, I think. So, but anyway, that house still exists, and you can see St. Paul's Church in the background there. And with the booklet, there's only one mention of an individual name or one photograph of an individual, and this is this guy, Monsignor Dunn. Anybody ever hear of him? Until I picked up the book and looked at it again, I had forgotten that I'd ever read his name. But he's the only individual that was featured in Marshfield Illustrated. And his claim to fame was that he had developed the Dunn fraud-proof ballot. Now, I'm not sure how much concern there was for fraud in 1900 for elections, but fraud-proof ballot. And so he actually filed a patent. Well, wait till you see it, though. His wife was a Wheelan girl from Marshfield. She actually died here in town about 10 years earlier. She's buried here, and then when he passed away, they brought him back here to be buried also. But the ballot, this is what the ballot looked like. It was a color-coordinated ballot. So this is the Democratic Party, this is the Prohibition Party, and all of these things are perforated. So if you want to vote for straight ticket, you just take the top part and put it in that envelope on the left, and what's left you put over here. If you want to vote, divided, so you want to vote for this guy for governor and that one for lieutenant governor, you could actually do that by tearing all those little pieces out, and then you had to put the votes in the one envelope and the leftovers in the other envelope. I don't know how long it was used, but I know they kept talking in the papers about the Dunn pocket ballot being on trial, and then it goes away. So, but that was his claim to fame, and he, in the early 1900s, he was running around the state promoting this, answering questions, giving presentations on the ballot system here from Marshfield. So if you want to see the images, you can actually go to Google Patents and type in Monsignor Dunn, and it will bring up all the paperwork for that patent application. So I've talked about 50 minutes, and I didn't want to talk too much longer. I've only hit some of the businesses that are included in the Marshfield Illustrated. If anyone wants to see a copy, Lori has a copy here that's in this, it's locked up in the cabinets, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't circulate, but you could always come and check it out here at the library. It's short, yes. We have a copy, we actually have a couple copies at the Upper Mansion. And